All right. All right, so I'll dive into it now. Thanks for bearing with me, everyone. So again, we're going to talk about the reintroduction of common loons to the Berkshires today. And we started this project in 2022. Before that, in 2020 to 2021, and a little bit before that, we were in southeastern Massachusetts, but also wanted to share some wealth to the rest of the state. So here we go. Excuse me. So loons in Massachusetts overall, they were extirpated by the 20th century. Really just saw a big decline, whether it was from recreational hunting and just the more urbanization of the habitat. And in 1975, we found the first nesting pair discovered on the Quabbin Reservoir, which is kind of more towards the center of the state. In 2023, there was about 51 nesting pairs statewide. They are a species of conservation concern in Massachusetts, and just generally based on their sort of life history. And they only usually have about 1 to 2 chicks a year, if at all. So really just this translocation project is trying to help repopulate the state of Massachusetts to its former extent, and just kind of speed up the natural process a little bit. So again, more on the population. There's about 51 pairs on 27 lakes, and about 40% occupy the Quabbin, which is right around here in the middle, like I said. If you include Wachusett Reservoir as well, that's about 53% of the state's population. So both of those are very productive. The adult loons are homebodies and they disperse within 5 miles or less. So that means if there's a pair of loons that's kind of nesting, let's say on this little yellow dot here, and hopefully you guys can see kind of the pointer there, but assuming that they hatch like 1 or 2 chicks, also with the common loon kind of biology and life history, they don't usually start nesting or breeding until they're at least 3 years old, but more typically we're seeing between 5 to 6 year old loons. So a loon that was born on a lake down here, within that 5 to 6 year range is likely going to re-inhabit um, lakes that are within 5 miles of that natal lake. And these are kind of the big three of conservation and management that we're working on, especially in Massachusetts, but also in Maine as well, where BRI is kind of stationed. So we have public outreach, whether it's presentations like this or just different signage that we have posted on the various reservoirs or little ponds that we're surveying. Just kind of informational stuff so that people that maybe aren't as familiar with loons know kind of what they're looking at. We'll have a lot of people that might kind of get them mixed up with mergansers or cormorants, which is totally fine, but just having a little bit more information out there is really helpful so that people know, one, what they're looking at, and then two, that it is just a sensitive species, and they should be given space and respect that people would also probably want if they were in their shoes. Also, we're doing artificial nesting platforms in Massachusetts to try to help bump up reproductive success. The artificial nesting platforms kind of help combat water or nest failures from water decline or incline, the water level. Another thing about loons is that they nest on the edge of shorelines because their legs are pretty far back on their bodies. And as a result, they don't walk very well on land like a duck or anything. So sometimes if you do see a loon, or if you're lucky enough and they're on land, they're either probably nesting or maybe in a little bit of trouble just from various kind of hazards that are out there in the world. But it's always good just to double check with wildlife professionals or even rehabbers or the environmental police are good resources. If you see a loon and you're not really sure, I think it's better to err on the side of caution if you think it's in distress, just so it can get the proper help that it needs. And then the third thing on the list is just the reintroduction or translocation project that we're kind of talking about now as well. And then this goes on again with the public outreach. The um, sort of pamphlet on the left is one that we gave out when we were first starting with the translocation project in southeastern Massachusetts. And we would just hand that out to people that came by the site, just so they had a better idea of how to respectfully share the lakes with loons. There's especially a lot of people seeing them. They are very beautiful. The chicks are very cute, so I don't blame people for wanting to take a closer look, but there are definitely signs to look out for that are important to respect um, while you're out there, just because I think, again, people would want kind of the same respect. And another threat based on sharing the lakes with loons is the picture on the right shows an X-ray image of a common loon that has lead sinkers and fishing tackle in it. So in a lot of states, they're working on kind of banning lead just because it's bad for all wildlife and people included. So the loons could eat fish that had been previously caught, which would maybe have the lead sinkers or fishing line stuff. Or even they could pick it up on their own. They have the kind of crop and gizzard for digestion, but usually like to have rocks in there as well that they intentionally eat to help kind of grind up the food, so it's a bit easier to digest. So it's just really important to use non-lead alternatives like tungsten, for example, when you're out fishing or even just out enjoying the lake. If you happen to see any sort of fishing tackle or line, like if you're able, it's nice to pick that up and take it out of the environment because it's not even just loons that it affects. It could be bald eagles, osprey, herons, all the birds and other wildlife that we enjoy seeing out there would really benefit from us being able to do what we can. There's more public outreach here. On the left-hand side is signs that we had posted up around the Assawamsett Pond Complex, where we had the southeastern translocation efforts. And then on the right is signs that we had up around our pen rearing site in the Berkshires. And these were good just so people kind of knew what we were doing. A lot of people would come over and talk to us who maybe didn't quite know what was going on and they thought we had like a Stranger Things type situation going on with weird experiments, but they're usually pretty happy to find out that it was actually just helping aid the reintroduction of loons in this region. So that was always good. And these are examples of the nesting platforms that I touched on earlier. So we're working on kind of deploying more artificial nesting platforms in Massachusetts. We have a very successful program with the nesting platforms up in the Rangeley region up in Maine, which, as they mentioned, is what I spend most of my summers working on. So you can kind of see it's cedar logs with a snow fencing or otherwise sort of meshy metal flooring. And then we load that with materials that we find from the surrounding areas, whether it's moss, pine needles, grasses. You can see little pine trees or spruces on there. And then it has that sort of camouflage cover. And that cover we call an avian guard. Just so one, it gives them a little shade, and two, they tend to have a not so nice relationship with bald eagles. So it just kind of helps give them a little cover from that and kind of reduce the amount of stress. Um, and these nesting platforms help enhance reproductive success on the reservoirs with unstable water levels. Because as I mentioned, balloons nesting on the shorelines, if the water comes up, it could flood the nest, or if it goes down, it could strand them from it. Just as I mentioned, their legs are really far back on their bodies, so it's hard for them to walk on land. So you might be asking, what is a loon translocation? And that is moving wild, healthy loon chicks from stable populations that are slow to recover naturally, or to areas that are slow to recover naturally. The goal is for these loon chicks to return to the final release site, which for this project would be in various places in Massachusetts. First, it was southeastern Massachusetts, and then now, more recently, it was in the Berkshires. And the idea of this is to help kind of give a boost to the population and just speed up the natural recovery of the populations. And why are we translocating the loons? In the East, common loons were widespread throughout New England and as far south as Pennsylvania and Iowa. And then, as I mentioned before, the populations were extirpated due to collecting of eggs and mass culling by humans over fisheries competition. If you've ever been out on a lake with a loon or just know kind of about them, they are very good at fishing. We often run into fishermen who kind of complain that the loons are eating all the fish. And like, what can we do about it? Which short answer is there's not totally much you can do about it. If you're fishing near loons, I would suggest waiting until they move to a different area just because I don't think that anyone wants to accidentally reel a loon in. They're very aggressive. Um, as beautiful as they are, they also have very sharp bills and just handling them through the various capture and other stuff. If you're not prepared, I think it is just a very sticky and dangerous situation that I wouldn't really want anyone in for the safety of the loons and also the safety of the fishermen as well. Um, and so, as I also mentioned before, the translocation effort is restoring a natural resource to the historic breeding range. Um, and why loon chicks? So we mentioned the adult loons have strong fidelity to an established breeding lake or area. So if you were to take an adult loon from a lake and move it even 50 miles out, I think that might be a bit extreme, but they definitely have a better sense of direction um, and site fidelity, especially if they're in a certain area, they know what they like. If they're breeding in a certain spot for year after year after year, and you move them somewhere else, I think it's just very likely that they're going to come back. And actually, it looks like they won't go back to the lake and they won't reestablish anywhere else, which is interesting. But the loon chicks will return to the general area from where they fledge, regardless of where they were born. So typically, we like to take chicks that are between 5 to 9 weeks old. And if they are in that age range, then they would go into the rearing pens that I'll have pictures of later on. And then if they're at 9 weeks, but like more well developed or older, then they would get directly released onto um, one of the chosen release sites out in the Berkshires. And so for the development of loon translocation, it started in 2015 to 2017 with the support from the Ricketts Conservation Foundation, which is out in the Midwest, I believe Wyoming. And they started with translocating 24 chicks from New York and Maine. There was a 100% success rate during that time. And as of 2019, 6 loons had been observed returning to the release area. And as a result, they're able to develop a successful method for translocation. And that's kind of this paper here as well, called a novel method for captive rearing and translocation of juvenile common loons. And for the 2020 side of things, this all came about with the 2003 oil spill in Buzzards Bay. So, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, there is at least, they think, about 500 common loons that died from oiling. Loons weren't the only species affected. I think they had pelicans and a bunch of other water birds, but because they're a species of concern in Massachusetts. I think that's another part of the reason why they were targeted. One, for this project, and two, um, just, I guess, yeah, for the project. But the oil spill later down the line just shows you how long it takes to kind of right wrongs. But they were able to get funding from the oil spill, which is good. So they have restoration projects for common loons in New England and New York, I believe. So Maine, Massachusetts, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, I think all the states put in for various different projects and received funding that they were able to then kind of put back into the environment and really just try to help out the species. And the trustees for the restoration projects, both federal and state agencies, determined projects to achieve the goal of restoring bird years lost from the oil spill. And so now we're on to more translocating loons to Massachusetts. They were identified as a priority restoration effort for loons. And after moving over to the Berkshires from 2022 to 2024, we successfully translocated 31 loon chicks over to the Berkshires over those 2 years. This is the translocation process here. So you can see an adult with 2 chicks there. There's some rearing pens. That's what it would look like for a loon chick within the pen. And then this is a photo post-release of a juvenile loon. You can see they have a bit of a different coloration from the adults. So usually they're in this sort of plumage for about the first 3 years. And then after that, they start getting the more iconic sort of black and white that we all know and love. This is just another sort of diagram to help kind of visualize the process. So over here on the left, we have someone spotlighting on the boat, another person with the binoculars that would likely be the one netting one of the 2 chicks. So we use the spotlight to kind of disorient them a little bit. And the chicks usually aren't quite as good at diving as their parents. So you kind of know within the first 10 minutes of going after a pair with 2 chicks if you're going to be successful or not. It doesn't stop them from trying for longer, but it is pretty good indication if the chicks are kind of just like diving and gone, you're in for maybe a long night. Or if they just kind of sit there and their parents maybe leave them, then it's usually a little bit easier. But that boat there is looking for, again, an adult loon with 2 chicks. And then, if successful, then you'll have a person driving the truck with the 1 chick that you get and bring it over to the certified vets that we use to do like a general health assessment of the chick. We have staff holding there. It can be kind of hard to see, but they're a lap full even in their young age. When you take various sort of blood and other measurements under the proper permitting as well. Once they get the okay from the vet, then back in the car, and it's a very long car ride to go from Maine to the Berkshires. It's about 4.5 hours. So we did try different methods to kind of split that up a little bit, whether it was meeting in Worcester or having people drive the whole way. It is definitely not for the faint of heart. But after that, there's 2 options. So if that's between that 5 to 9 week old age, then you have the loon chick going into the pen. Or if it's 9 weeks and up, then it can be directly released. The birds in the pen will be there until they're about 9, 10 weeks old, just depends on how well they're doing. And then after that, they would go and get sort of, we do a brief sort of analysis, take more measurements, put the color bands and the unique USGS sort of silver band on their legs, record all of that data, and then drive it to the release site, which is another thing too. If they are old enough just for direct release, we call it. They get color banded before they come down so that we can just release them because as a result of it being a long drive, usually they're getting released between 2 a.m. kind of at the earliest and 5 or 6 a.m. And usually if you're driving overnight, um, you don't really want to think about which colors need to go on what leg and all of that different stuff because I think that a lot more mistakes would be made if that were the case. Let's see. So again, we have the loon pairs with chicks. We only go after pairs that have two chicks in them. And we take one of the two chicks, and then the chicks have to be at least 5 weeks old. Just if they are closer to 5 weeks old, then they spend a little bit longer in the pen. And we typically don't like to do that. They can get a little bit more habituated to the sort of feeding um, rig that we have set up. Um, and you just feel kind of bad. It is like a good project, but just kind of having them in a 8 by 16 or 10 by 20, I think, sized rectangle, it does feel really good to let them go. So I think this past year, especially, we tried to get chicks that were no younger than 6 weeks old, just so that they didn't have to spend an extended amount of time in the loon pens. And then this also touches on the transport before they go into the pens. We have special holding tubs that we made. So you can kind of see it's just a regular plastic tote, but they've drilled out some holes here and then zip tied in a mesh bottom that's sort of like a hammock so that they don't scrape their feet on the bottom of the tote. And usually they do poop quite a lot during transport. So the mesh netting kind of helps them not sit directly in their poop, um, which is nice for them. I don't know about you guys, but I wouldn't really want to be sitting in my own poop for a 4 hour car ride. um, but in those tubs, those go into the truck. And when we're in the trucks, it has to be really quiet. We don't listen to the radio, keep it cooler, have like the AC on. So usually we're bundled up with a bunch of layers and hats and blankets. And you might have a earbud in or something just so you can listen. Because yeah, driving overnight for 4 hours is pretty tough and would be a lot tougher without any music or something to just kind of try to keep you alert. Um, and they're taken in those transport totes to either the pen site where we would go drive there, take the boat, drive over to the designated pen that they would go in, and then put them in. Or if it's going to a release lake, then we drive to that spot, um, carry the tote over to the water's edge, walk in a little ways, and then lift the loon out of the tote, kind of set them in the water for a little bit, let them acclimate, um, and then let them go, turn off the headlamps, and just kind of step away slowly so as to not startle them further. And then here I'm going to just pass it over to Thomas for a little bit. He's going to touch on the rearing process a little bit more and kind of the day-to-day tasks that we did. And if it's easier, Thomas, I don't know if this works, but I could just keep this PowerPoint up. And then if you just say next when you're all set, I could press the space button and um, take you to the next slide, if that makes sense.
Okay, that works for me.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So yes, rearing. We've gotten to the pens. The chicks have been transferred and we are in the Berkshires, specifically Windsor Reservoir, if you know where that is. So we, like Emily said, we were pumping those chicks out. We really did not have chicks stay for more than about 2 weeks this season because we really want to get them developed quickly and then send them off. And so when we say pen loons are monitored daily, what does that mean? We monitor them for behavioral development and physiological development. So we really keep an eye out for indicators that they are ready to fledge, like wing flapping and increased frequency of vocalizations. Wing flapping, very literally making attempts at flying out. Loons have dense bones, so they can dive, and that means they're very heavy. And so loons need an extremely long takeoff pad in order to take off from the water. And so that's why they practice for weeks and weeks, sometimes months. You'll see them flapping and you'll say, oh, I think they're ready to go. So we monitor the loons when they're in the rearing pens 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, in morning and evening shifts in pairs of two. Very often, one person is staying behind to monitor behavior and development, and another is um, picking up fish. We feed them live fish from a bait shop in Granby that was able to meet our tremendous fish demand. These loons are being fed between 250 and 300 shiners a day. And we try and supplement the nutritional diversity of that with trapped fish in minnow traps that the Fish and Wildlife Service was kind enough to lend to us. And that way they're getting it's like a supplemental dietary measure. And it really helps. We feed them crawfish and bullheads and little perch and pumpkin seeds, and it's fun to watch them really go for a wild animal that has a lot of vitality. The shiners are more like bait fish. And the rearing season is from August to October. And Emily, could you go to the next slide, please?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is looking into the inside of the pen, I believe, from our blind. So the POV is looking through the blind, and that's where we feed them. And we feed them through this great big tube. It's a PVC pipe that goes all the way in the water. And the reason that there's that netting going along the top is mostly to really block out any surrounding goings on from them because they can easily get stressed out. And we also don't want them to see us. That's the main thing. So often when we're going around the pens, we're ducked down in the boat because we really don't want them to be aware of our presence. And the reason for that is that if the loons are aware that they are habitually being provided food by an external source, we are concerned that they wouldn't develop the instinctual drive to pursue their own food and hunt. And so that's another developmental trait that we look for is we want to make sure that they are diving well and catching fish adequately on their own. And so that goes back to the silence in the car and the silence as we're feeding them. We just want to really eliminate any human habituation. And that's also so that when we finally release them, they're not so comfortable with humans and going right up to everybody's fishing line because that would not be good. Okay, yeah, I think you can move on, Emily. That's just a visual of the rearing pen. So this is over at Wacona Falls State Park, the Windsor Reservoir. The left photo is from where we would do our monitoring. And so you can see we had to, that teal or turquoise fabric is a little extra blind so because we were kind of on a hill looking down on them. And on the picture on the right is another picture from inside. So the green netting is more of those blinds. I think the picture in the previous slide was before we had installed the canvas, but that green up top, that's the blinds from us. And then the aqua netting is what that white netting is. And that goes all the way down into the muck. And that is, of course, so that wild animals aren't getting in and the fish we feed them aren't flying out immediately. And so it helps keep everything very contained. Emily, thank you. Okay, so this is where we sourced our loons from this year, our loons, the loons. So we were able to source 4 from Vermont, and we were able to source the rest from Maine. And so, back to Emily's point on site fidelity or return, you can see the distance is really tremendous, and it's impressive that an adult would be able to return to its site. And so, that's another reason why we choose the chicks. So, that's where they're coming from. It's a really cool visual. If you want to go to the next slide, Emily. Oh yes. Okay. So the rearing season, like I said, is from August to October. And so in that season, that doesn't mean that all 12 loons we raised were released at the end of October. You know, the first, I believe, was released in the second week of August, even the first week. And so as August, September, and October roll on, Emily and I, along with three other biologists, we would take turns surveying about once a week for the loons that we'd already released and trying to get an idea of their activity. So, admittedly, it is pretty hard to keep track of them, which is what we found is that they most likely have just very quickly gone on to the ocean when we return to a site and we don't re-site them. We generally consider that to be thumbs up, good thing, assuming that they weren't preyed upon by a predator. What we really want to see is that they all get out of here, you know, because that means that we've raised them to the developmental capacity under which they can take off. And so if you see here, this was 2023 last year, Buckley Dunton to Stockbridge Bowl. That was a resite that we were able to get. And then this year, Center Pond to Goose Pond. So both of those instances are from Beckett to Stockbridge and then Beckett to Lee, or maybe the Lee Tyringham line. And as far as I know, the Goose Pond moon is still there, unless it's not. I hope he has moved on. But hopefully we are going to have more resites in the future. Could you move on, Emily? Okay, yes. So here are the total loons that we have released in Berkshire County. It's really, really great. Emily, you can chime in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in the initial assessment, when the research was being done to sort of determine what was an appropriate number of loons to be released in Massachusetts, those numbers were based on what we believed that the ecosystem could reasonably absorb without coming at a cost to increase competition among loons. I believe the number was around 30 loons. So
Yeah,
we
I think you're right with that.
okay, great, great. So we hit the goal and no more releases. That it's so fun. I would love to keep doing it, but we are done releasing the loons, and now next year, 2025, uh, the spring 2025 should be when we expect to see our first batch of loons from 2022 return from the ocean. So it is a thrilling, thrilling time for BRI. I really, really, I can't wait to see loons. You know, the dream image is to see loons just popping up all over Berkshire County. So, audience, keep an eye out next spring. And Emily, if you could move on to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, yep. So this is the statewide survey sites for loons. So these sites are covered in the central region by primarily Mass Wildlife. The northeast and southeast region are covered by our East Massachusetts loon biologist. And then I am the Western Massachusetts loon biologist who covers the Western region. And the Western region is all of Berkshire County, as well as the western parts of Hampshire, Franklin, and Hampton County. That makes up about 55 sites and counting right now. As we are aware, there are 4 established breeding pairs in the West region that have produced 6 chicks for us this year. For us, it's not for us. But there's certainly more pairs than that in the Berkshires and in Western Massachusetts. We have a lot of mysterious pairs of loons that they show up and then they disappear and they're not banded, and we say, where are you, where did you go? So when I say that we have 4 breeding pairs, that is not to say that there are simply 8 loons in the West region. There are definitely more. But we also have four sites where we have established our artificial floating nest rafts, and hopefully we will have a lot more of those on the docket for 2025. Most often, those are placed in private access drinking water bodies, and that's primarily because loons like that due to there being no people. Which is a plus for loons being there, and a minus for loons being there is that drinking water bodies very often fluctuate to demand. And so that makes it a prime candidate for a nest raft location. So we're really hoping to implement that more in Western Massachusetts, especially as we hopefully are getting increased loon traffic. But as Emily said, so next year we're going to get our 3-year-olds from 2022. It is going to be a number of years more before they're able to breed. Again, 5 to 6 years is when they begin to attempt mating and nesting. I think I'm good, Emily, if you want to move on. Okay, yep. So there's more of that. So when it says to date, 12 out of 24 loons have been reobserved. Those have all been in Eastern Massachusetts because 12 have been released this year, 2024. So 24 loons, 12 observed. That's really, I mean, I feel like that is a very successful metric for us. And that really is affirming that what we're doing is having an impact. And again, this data is all from Eastern Mass. We don't have any from West Mass. I'm sure you're all wondering, well, like, did it work? And you'll have to stay tuned. I think you can move to the next slide, Emily, please. Oh yes, our health assessment. Okay, so we're back in the world of capture, whether that is for direct release or for being placed in pens. So we typically perform a health assessment on our loons before and after capture, not when they've been directly released, but they'll receive a health assessment before being placed in the pens. And that always involves blood samples and feather samples to analyze for mercury and other contaminants. I believe BRI recently began testing for PFAS. Ecotoxicology is a really dynamic and emerging world in conservation that is getting our attention more and more. And we are finding PFAS, unfortunately, in high concentrations in loons and in loon eggshells. But we analyze them for that. We get their weight. We also get a general impression of them. Emily, you can chime in as to what you think of this, but I very often find that loons, they are very different when you capture them. Some are very docile and calm, and others just, they possess so much vitality and they have so much fight and they hate you when you're capturing them. And for us, that's a really good sign, just a sign of really vital instinct and, in my opinion, good survival. And so when we do that, we will capture them in the pens. And like Emily said, primarily that is through a floodlight. We use artificial vocalizations, usually on an electronic device. There's a number of acoustic devices out there that you can like buy online for your friends for Christmas that make silly loon sounds that are very realistic. We haven't used those. We generally use the electronic way, but that sort of coaxes them towards the pole net that we use to retrieve them. And then we bring them back to shore and we do the health assessment, like I've said. And Emily, if you could move on to the next slide. More about capture and handling. I have notes on that, don't I? Well, Emily, you actually covered that very much. That was more about I was going to talk about the timeline, but yes, it's typically when we hear that the main folks are doing a capture, we being Emily, myself, and the 3 other biologists in Western Mass for the August to October rearing season. 2 of us will probably leave around 11:30 and then meet in Worcester 1:30, 2 o'clock. And then we will go to the pens and drop the loon off. And then, of course, at the other end, when they're ready to be released, that is when we do the capture again. Capturing in a pen is way easier then, and a great big water body. Emily, could you move on to the next slide? Yes, the leg banding. So all of our loons receive a unique color and pattern combination that no other loon has. And that we have that for obvious reasons. All of our loons receive a federal silver band on the left leg with a number engraved that identifies that loon, and that data is available to the Fish and Wildlife Service, who will hopefully eventually take on the loon monitoring project in perpetuity when funding runs out for BRI's efforts there. And it's really cool. You can see that there's the dots and the stripes, and that alone allows for such a vastly larger number of combinations than we could if it was just um, solid colors alone. And if I'm not mistaken, there's also colors that are not appearing here because they are unique to a certain state. I know that the Adirondack Loon Council uses pink, which I would love if we used pink, but we can't because it's theirs, and that's okay. It helps us differentiate. And when we put the bands on the loons, we definitely factor in, I think, a few millimeters of future growth for them. When we capture the adults, obviously they're fully grown, so we can just put them right on. But we use a little dot of super glue and we make sure it's all dried up, and we want them to not feel like really restrained and want them to feel comfortable in it. I think that's good, Emily. If you want to move on. Is this over to you? I believe,
I
Emily.
believe it is. And then really quick, with the banding as well, I just want to touch on these bands kind of help us recite individuals in the wild post release. So when Thomas and the other biologists are in Massachusetts, or even the work I do up in Maine, it can be challenging for sure. I know Thomas can attest to that. But we look for these sort of unique color combinations where we have a sort of chart printout of each individual where it has the band number, the lake they were caught on, what territory they're normally in. Um, and then you can kind of have a better idea of what an individual is up to. Without the color markings of the bands, if they only had the unique silver numbered band, we would have to recapture them every year just to know exactly what they're up to. But having the color markers allows us to monitor their activity in a less invasive way. So we're not constantly handling them year after year after year. And yes, we do recapture the same individuals maybe a couple of times, but we usually like to space it out by a few years. And with that information, we could compare, say, blood mercury levels or the other contaminants, just kind of comparing over time to see if there's more mercury in the environment or more of a certain contaminant, or say you're in an area where um, there is, I think I've been seeing a lot more in the news with firefighting foams that had PFAS in them or the forever chemicals. If you're monitoring a lake and you have banded loons on it before, and say some of those chemicals knowingly entered the water body, accidentally, of course, then you have a baseline to see kind of what their levels were pre exposure versus afterwards. And you can kind of see loons are a very good bioindicator species. So the translocation effort is really good there too. If you have loons on your body of water, it's probably doing pretty good because they're eating the fish, and generally aren't on dirty, polluted bodies of water, which I can't really say that I blame them. But um, circling back to the loon banding, if we were to see these birds out in the wild, I'm just going to combine these two legs just for the sake of example, but this would be the right leg here. And if I were looking at this from a boat with binoculars, and likely could probably see, I think that's orange. So orange 4 over blue 4 would be the right leg. And then for the sake of this exercise, we'll say this is silver, even though I think it might be white. But just to have a full combination, silver over blue on the left leg. So we would write that down, look at the chart later, and be like, okay, yeah, this bird was banded maybe a mile up this particular lake. So they were first in one territory, but maybe switched to another one just based off of disputes or maybe repairings, because as was what once was thought before is that loons are monogamous, but they're not. And the color banding also helped us learn that as well. So just the color banding as well. We try to minimize the stress, whether it's collecting samples and getting the bands on. We like to keep that handling time to 30 minutes or less just to limit the stress as much as we can. But it does just have a really big payoff at the end and can contribute to so much data collection, which is so important for conservation.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say before you go on, Emily, is that I'm sure there's a whole array of post-webinar resources that BRI can send to Taylor and Charlotte to distribute, but we do have a banding chart. I'm sure viewers are very excited about how they can get involved. And if you ever observe loons with bands on them, that is the best way to aid in our data efforts. So we'll make sure that you guys have access to that chart so that you can um, be a participant out in the world with this.
Yeah, and then just touching on the successful breeding of loons, specifically from the translocation project. In 2020, there was the first nesting attempt and successful hatch of a chick in southeastern Massachusetts in over 100 years. And that involved a loon from the translocation class, I think in 2015. Um, and it was a reservoir in Fall River. Yep, the male was part of the translocation class in 2015. Um, and I believe it paired with an unbanded bird, but it is just kind of proof that the project is working. It just takes time. Like Thomas and I have both touched on, they're not breeding until they're about 5 or 6. Um, Specifically in the Berkshires, we might expect to see nesting pairs in 2027, 2028, kind of at the earliest, where you may still see some of those chicks kind of coming to visit. But it is just a project that'll take some time. So we just have to keep up the faith and hold out hope, and just be very patient with it as well. And then in 2024, there was another translocated male from 2015 that successfully hatched a chick on Wachusett. And there's another few sort of translocated birds from that southeastern project that have been seen recently. They just maybe aren't breeding, but the thing about loons also is that they're not going to do everything you want them to do all the time. Like, it would be great and so easy if we could just tell them, hey, like, start breeding and like really try hard and hatch the chicks, so that you can help everyone out. But there's just so many external factors that doesn't always work out quite as we hoped it would. And so it's not necessarily a linear progression upwards into success. Like, there's going to be some hardships, but you just maintain patience. I really hope that we'll have some good results. And as Thomas said, just stay tuned, um, and be really patient, and hopefully good things are on the way. And so for 2025 and onward, we'll have the continued monitoring of lakes statewide in Massachusetts to look for returning individuals and breeding activity. So focusing on trying to find previously translocated loons, but also we want to look at the just all of the breeding activity, not just that specific to the translocated chicks. Long-term goal is permanent loon monitoring by mass wildlife and citizen science volunteers. And then we just want to continue public outreach for loon conservation in Massachusetts. Um, I think it's safe to say not everyone in Massachusetts knows what a loon looks like. You might go out to the lake, and just think it's some kind of weird big duck or a goose. And so just continuing to do outreach and different events will really help the loons just kind of thrive in that environment. And also, I think it's exciting for people too, once they kind of realize, like, oh my gosh, I've never seen one of those, or my parents talked about that sort of thing. It is just really wholesome. And as we both kind of touched on before, you can report a banded loon Here we have the BRI website, www.briwildlife.org. There you can see all of our loon work kind of programs. They also do a lot of raptor work. There's some waterfowl or duck projects, offshore wind stuff. A lot of happenings at BRI that's so much more than loons, even though that's kind of where it all started out. But just if you're curious, you can just kind of go around the website. There's a lot of stuff to look at. And it's just pretty cool to see things that people are working on. And then you can kind of see here, have you seen a banded loon? Even if you don't have all of the band information, usually there's the four, so three color and one silver. It kind of helps if you have a picture, but obviously that's kind of above. Not everyone has like $1,000 camera just casually zooming around. So any information could really just be helpful, or even just notifying us if you see a loon, whether it could be in the Berkshires or areas where we don't have previous records of them. That is still just good information. Where whether it's Thomas or anyone kind of just in Massachusetts, it's worth going to check on that to see what's going on in that area. And then here we have the project partners. You can kind of see the loon swimming underwater here. That's a younger bird. You can kind of see their legs are pretty flat, um, oblong too, not like round like a duck or regular kind of bird leg. So those bands that we had further back, we have to specially order from a company in Canada. Um, and before that, they used to make them themselves, which honestly, kudos to them. It seems like a lot of work. So I'm happy that we're able to source those out somewhere else as well. But again, too, you can kind of see just how far back their legs are, which are really good for propelling them under the water. But as soon as they climb up onto shore, not so much. But here we have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, the Maine DFI and W, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, the Assawamsett Pond Complex, and then the Dalton Fire District, who really helped us with one, finding a reservoir for use for the pen reared chicks in the Berkshires, and just helped with any other sort of problems or just to say hi. And then again, the agency trustees, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, the Mass Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, Mass DEP, Rhode Island's Department of Environmental Management, and yeah, those are just the sort of emblems there. And then this wouldn't really be possible without all the collaborators and volunteers. So on the left, you can see collaborators and volunteers, whether it was Assawamsett Pond Complex staff, the Dalton Fire District, Mass DCR, and then on the right, just all the BRI staff that have helped out with different sort of aspects of it, whether it was helping out with capture, helping us down in the pens, helping set the pens up, um, taking the pens down. And yeah, it really just takes a village. It's not a small feat by any means. So yeah, and I think that is it. So I can, I guess, stop sharing. But if anyone has any questions, hopefully that was informative
It's
and
really
not too much.
Not at all. It's so wonderful. Thank you so much for putting that all together with you.
Oh yeah, no
Does
problem.
anybody have any questions? I know there were a couple, there's a silly one in the chat, which is kind of funny. That you guys don't dress up as adult loons, right? That would go against the habituation. Is that kind of the word you use?
I
Yeah.
do have a loon patterned cowl that goes over you like this, and when I wear that, sometimes the loons come close. That's all I'll say. And it's a real exciting moment. Maybe I'll be a
Yeah,
loon for Halloween.
In the past, they had tried, I think in 2015 to 2017, they had a sort of puppet that they would have on, and they tried to incorporate that into the feeding, but the chicks started attacking it. So it didn't really work out too well. But if they had a good loon costume, I would put it on. For the chicks or not, I just think it'd be cool.
Um, Taylor, it looks like oh, maybe this is from the viewers. Do loons need half a mile of open water to take off? Emily, I don't think so. That seems like a whole lot.
I don't quite think like half a mile, but usually they're on ponds that are at least 60 acres, and they do need a long sort of runway. So, unlike other birds, they have more dense bones. They don't really have hollow bones. And as a result, they don't just pop off the water like a duck. So they kind of do a running on top of the water with like a wing assisted flap. Um, and if they don't have enough water, then they can kind of get stuck and they can't take off. Um, but usually they run or doing the wing assisted flapping. Um, and then they take like a few laps kind of around until they can gain elevation and then kind of shoot off to another spot, whether it's the ocean or another pond. But I don't think they need quite half a mile, which is good for them.
We also have what is the average lifespan of a loon? I don't even think we know that information. I think they are very long lived. 25 to 30-ish is what we think.
Yeah, there
Is that correct?
is. There's a pair in Wisconsin, I think, like Seney National Wildlife Refuge. If I'm pronouncing that right, I could totally be butchering it, but I believe they're at least 32 years old, maybe even 35.
Wow.
But that's also ties into the kind of color banding where if we band an adult, we assume they're at least 5 or 6 years old, but that's kind of the baseline that we have. So we don't know their exact age. And I know they're working on ways to try to figure out their age from blood work, but that is just way above my head. I'm not fully in with that sort of technology yet. But um, with banding the chicks, assuming they survive into adulthood, we're able to get a more precise kind of number on how old they are. With the adults, it can be a bit more of a guessing game. But I think at least into the like 20s, I feel like there's a lot of loons, kind of, especially in Maine, um, in Rangeley particularly. They've been monitoring that population for at least 25 years. Some of which have been banded as chicks, but even if they were as adults, we definitely have some late 20-year-olds up there, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Another question we have is what animals prey on loons? And so there are two answers to this. One of which is who preys on loon chicks and who preys on loon adults. When loon chicks reach 6 weeks of age, I believe, they achieve kind of a maximum of a 70 or 75% survival likelihood. They sort of pass this threshold where they're not going to be preyed upon. And that can be anything from eagles and osprey to snapping turtles. Raccoons and river otters love little baby, sweet baby loons. Also eggs, I would say, especially for raccoons and otters. They like to swim out, and that's a factor of consideration when we put our nest traps out. It has to be far enough away so that the raccoons don't get them. But as far as adults are concerned, I believe the largest cause of death of adult loons is other loons. Is that correct, Emily?
Yeah, I think that is right. And then there have been instances of bald eagles and adults that get into different fights. We have records of eagles eating loons that are stuck in the ice. So that kind of ties into like that
Oh.
larger runway for takeoff where it seems to be more of a problem with the sort of changing climate where ice is coming in a bit later. So loons are kind of staying put where they are longer. And then a sudden freeze comes over, and then they're just kind of in like a 10-foot pool essentially. And then a few eagles kind of come by. And if it gets any colder, there's only so long you can kind of maintain that 10-foot spread. Um, and so, yeah, we got a few reports of eagles, unfortunately, picking away at loons last winter.
I would definitely say, in my experience, that eagles are maybe the sworn enemy of loons.
Yeah.
I see loons do territorial vocalizations at eagles all the time. Even if they just fly overhead, they give this wail that says, sort of, get out of here. And then the eagles don't get out of there. They watch, and it's scary to watch.
There was that story too of an adult loon that they think killed an eagle as well. So it had the sort of puncture on its chest. And they
Mm.
found a dead eagle nearby. So they do fight back. They are not to be messed with, I think.
Well, you guys kind of naturally answered a question that's in the Q&A box, which was, does the increasing eagle population impact translocated loons? So, the bald eagle population increasing.
Yes, I've heard of
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
I would say,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. So some other questions are all coming in here in the Q&A box. Has there been any work to track the translocated loons to see what areas they are using? So,
Most definitely, yes. So right now, in the Berkshires, we have only relocated 2 loons that have fled from their site of release. Um, but that those resites took place in the same year in which the release took place. If this person is asking, are there efforts being taken to relocate translocated loons after their 3-year stint in the ocean? Yes. And the data we have from that is the 12 out of 24 released loons in the eastern Massachusetts region that have been resited since, I believe, 2020, which is a very substantial metric in our eyes. So in terms of the effort and the future of the effort of this project, as we've made clear, it's very funding dependent. So we have 1 more year of BRI conducting the monitoring directly. So we will have a Western Massachusetts and Eastern Massachusetts biologist again. And after that, we are hoping that Mass Wildlife will take on the monitoring forevermore.
great, thanks. So let's see. All right, another question here. Is there enough open water habitat in Western Mass? And then this person added, what about parking lots? Which I'm not totally sure what that means, but maybe they're talking about parking lots taking over water habitat.
Oh, perhaps. Well, as we've said before, the 30 loons that we have released in Berkshire County, or in the West region, I should say, granted they all were released in Berkshire County. The 30 loons is the estimated number of loons that the ecosystem could reasonably absorb. Again, that's without posing risk to competition among existing loons in the region. So there is an abundance of locations in the West region for that loons can reasonably be nesting in. As I've said, the West region currently has 55 sites that we watch for loons in, and we've seen loons in a very small fraction of those, which makes sense for what we're doing. Hopefully that is going to change. So I would say yes, there's definitely a large availability of habitat.
I did see further down too. I think there's a follow-up that loons mistake parking lots for water and land on them and get
Oh,
stuck, which is a valid concern, especially after any rain event. Just sort of the wet pavement looks kind of like water. And that does happen. I haven't necessarily heard of that a lot in the Berkshires, but if you look at any sort of wildlife rehabber page on Facebook, um, especially in New England, even in the Midwest, I think that is a concern. Well, like, usually they'll bring those birds in and kind of evaluate to see if there's any major kind of injuries aside from just abrasions from the pavement. But usually, if they are given the okay, then they'll either bring them out um, to an unfrozen body of water, I guess, depending on the time of year, um, or maybe even out to the ocean, depending. Because I think that was also another question too, about where do loons go in the winter, and they typically will go out on either inland bodies of water that don't freeze, or they may even go out in the ocean. So if you're out in the Cape, you could see a bunch of loons. Casco Bay up in Maine gets a lot of loons. So they're just kind of hanging out in the coastal areas. And what's also interesting is during non-breeding periods, they're a lot more social, where during the summer, they're more likely to get into territorial disputes and fights with other loons. But in the winter and even towards the end of the breeding season, you might see a group of up to 20 loons on a lake, per se, or even in the hundreds out on the ocean, which is really cool to see if you get the chance. Um, it's nice to see them all in one place and not being mean to each other.
Very cool.
A couple questions here that involved other loon restoration areas. So one question about, is Connecticut involved in loon restoration? And I think this falls into a similar vein. Is there any collaboration with loon population studies in northern Connecticut, southern Vermont, and Berkshire?
I think there has been some collaboration. I believe it might have been 2021, possibly, where we heard about a nesting pair in Massachusetts or Connecticut, excuse me, for the first time in a very long time. And I believe we had sort of the southeastern Massachusetts biologist surveying in both Rhode Island and Connecticut on occasion when possible, just to try to see, um, looking at kind of eBird data, if people had reported seeing loons, just either trying to go and double check to verify, um, or even just looking at surrounding bodies of water. But I will say, I think the restoration efforts in Connecticut and Rhode Island are a bit less, but it's not to say that there couldn't be something maybe more down the line. I think they just maybe would wait to see um, more sort of return data on the Massachusetts population before diving into that as well.
yeah, I would also say that they were asking about Southern Vermont, and the Vermont Center for Eco Studies was really instrumental in helping us this year, especially with the translocation of four chicks, or the attempted translocation of four chicks from Vermont. Their surveying actually accidentally overlapped with mine, and we sort of ran into each other. Like, I called and I was like, "Hi, I'm trying to find the loons," and Vermont Center for Eco Studies answered, and they're like, "We already are covering the loons," and so we do have this relationship, and it was really fun to see. And then they were able to help us capture the Vermont loons. A volunteer actually from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies came along with us for the Vermont capture, so that was really fun. And we are in contact at times, I think, with the Adirondack Loon Council, as well as the LPC, the Loon Preservation
Preservation Committee,
Committee
yeah.
in New Hampshire. The Loon world, it's pretty intimate. We all know each other to a degree, I would say.
Another question here about where you might find loons around here. So would you expect to see loons at any Berkshire lake, say Garfield or Buell?
I have never seen a loon at Garfield or Buell, and I have looked dozens of times. Um, any Berkshire lake, I mean, that's hard to answer. There are lots of lakes that I have observed in the West region that I've said, wow, I'm pretty surprised that I haven't seen loons here, particularly in Otis and Tyringham and Tolland, like those really remote places. If you've never been to Tyringham, the drive is beautiful. But hopefully we are gonna see more in the future. But yeah, no to Garfield and Buell. Sorry.
Yeah, I would say a good indicator is if a water body has a good fish population, that's a good start. And then next is just seeing if there's good habitat as well for nesting, whether it's like a grassy portion. Loons also really like islands as well. Um, but if it's a really rocky shoreline with not much vegetation around, even if the fish are good, they may go to fish, but would probably look to nest elsewhere.
Got it. Thanks. All right. A few more here. So, let's see. Do loons ever suffer death from boat collisions?
They do, unfortunately. Part of the or what went into where we released the translocated chicks was trying to go to places with less motorboat traffic, especially in areas where people might not know what a loon is. Sometimes they're really good at kind of evading boat traffic, but a chick that's been translocated initially might not be the best at sort of skirting that hazard. I think it's possibly more of an issue that we hear about in New Hampshire, where they have a lot of boating traffic. Unfortunately, I think there's been reports of people intentionally driving at adults and chicks, which I personally just don't understand how or why anyone could do that. But there are people out there that just lack respect or basic human decency, I guess. But generally speaking, if you are in a motorboat and see kind of loons, they do dive a lot and are generally smart enough to not dive straight into the propeller. But I probably wouldn't be full throttle going through an area where loons are, just to err on the side of caution.
Got it. So I just saw this kind of story comment from Doug Hyde. He's talking about Lake Buell. So for the first year, he says we did have a nesting loon with two chicks this summer. And he says that we have a lot of nesting mergansers, but typically only see and hear loons when migrating in the spring and fall. We have a pair of nesting eagles here, which probably isn't ideal for them. And fortunately, the eagles seem to prefer young geese, though. And he says this is on Lake Buell, so I guess a little bit of data for you all from.
Yeah, if you could, if Doug Hyde is consenting to continued contact, put him in touch with us. I would love to talk to him more about that.
Absolutely, great. So a few more. Let's see. Okay, the sound of a loon is awesome. Do they vocally talk to each other?
They do. They have four vocalizations. Loons have the yodel, the tremolo, the wail, and the hoot. The tremolo and the wail, I would say, are the more casual means of conversation. The wail is often the vocalization that a loon will make to announce its arrival on a water body. Tremolo is more of a back and forth conversation. You'll hear loons tremoloing across bodies of water saying, "Where are you? I'm here. Oh, I'm over here. Let's meet over here," or something. And hooting is very often a form of communication that takes place A, during courtship, and B, between chicks and their parents. Emily, if you have more to say on that, please feel free.
Yeah. And then also just the fourth one, the yodel, um, is one of the only ways you can tell them apart sexually. So they look very similar between males and females. There's a slight size difference where females are a little smaller than males, but unless they're right next to each other, um, you could have a really big female and a small male. There is a bit of overlap kind of with the weight, but if you hear one do the yodel, then you know that's a male because females can't make that sound, which is a fun fact.
Great. I have this stuffed animal here that's supposed to make a call that I wanted to, demonstrate to you all, but I keep on squishing it and it just won't come out. So
Stage
Aww.
fright.
hopefully everyone here has had the chance to hear a loon either, online or in person. I know a lot of people mistake their call for what is it, like a coyote or some other, a wolf, some other large mammal, because it's just so otherworldly. So just two more questions from Mark Thorne. They are, or one of them's a question, one of them's a comment. So question was Lucas Savoy, who's supposed to join us tonight, another wildlife biologist on the BRI team. Was Lucas able to reestablish the raft at Upper Reservoir in Lee? And was any loon activity recorded? I guess he was involved in that project somehow.
I guess so. Mark, if we've met, I apologize. I don't, your name is not ringing a bell. Yes, I was able to put the nest raft in at Upper Reservoir this spring and take it out in October. And there was some activity in the spring and the fall, and there was very little activity in the summer. And this has been the trend of this pair for 2 years.
Got it. Okay. And finally, just a comment. Mark says that he has seen loons taking off and landing approximately 150 feet is the takeoff.
That sounds aligned with my observations.
Yeah. I think they can take or may have a shorter runway in the event of a good wind as well.
Right.
They can kind of use that to their advantage.
Mhm.
If there are no more questions, I did want to say just like a few things about loons and their ecosystem services. Is there an item that you wanted to get to, Charlotte or Taylor?
No, we're supposed to wrap up around 6:30. But go for it. I was going to ask you this question because you had mentioned it in the chat, and
Oh, great.
has to do with, I think, conservation as well. So
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. The reason I wanted to bring it up mostly is because I think, the question often comes up when I share the Loon project with people and they say, well, why are you doing this? And when we say, oh, it's part of the historic range, the answer kind of sounds like, well, because they used to be here. And they say, okay, well, like, why should they be here again? And that's where their ecosystem services come into play. Loons are a very valuable contributor to their ecosystem. So they prefer to prey upon warm water fish species. And if you aren't aware, warm water fish species are advantaged by the onset of climate change and warming waters. And so, in that manner, they do give cold water fish species a bit of an advantage in a greater context in which they are currently being outcompeted. Loons also offer a very useful custodial service by being managers of pest and disease. That's very simply because diseased and injured fish are much easier to catch, and so they can stop the spread of harmful disease and pathogens simply by being present in the water. And as Emily has said before, loons are very quick to accumulate environmental pollutants in their body because of where they are seated on the food chain. And so presence of a loon on a body of water is an indicator that the body of water is very healthy. That was kind of the only little tidbits I had to say, but just wanted to convey that loons are doing directly daily important work just by being loons and participating in their ecosystem. It makes it very resilient.
wonderful.
Awesome. Learning how it's like applicable to the future too. So I think that we're all concerned, about that. So it's really great to hear that part of their contribution. But really good questions, everybody, and thank you for such great answers. And yeah, does anybody else have anything to share? Someone said thank you for the excellent informative presentation. I agree. Yeah, I mean, I've been waiting to make this joke all presentation, so I just think that your passion for the reintroduction efforts is illuminating. Thank you so much for sharing all of this tonight. It's been really interesting. And we will, and Emily, thank you for filling in on such short notice for Lucas, and it was amazing. We will share some resources as a follow-up. Charlotte